When this German ace saved 9 Americans, one became his brother for life. Part 1. The Crippled Giant, December 20th, 1943. The sky over northern Germany is a frozen graveyard. High above the clouds, a lone American B-17 bomber, nicknamed the Olde Pub, is struggling to stay in the air. This wasn't just a damaged plane. It was a miracle of physics that it was still flying at all. A few minutes earlier, the bomber had been shredded by German anti-aircraft fire and swarmed by Messerschmitt fighters. The nose was blown open. The tail gunner was dead. The waist gunners were wounded and bleeding out in the sub-zero temperatures. Out of the 4 massive engines, only 1.5 were still working. The internal oxygen system was destroyed, and the hydraulic fluid was frozen. Behind the controls was Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old farm boy from West Virginia. He was terrified, exhausted, and barely conscious. He was trying to fly a 60,000-pound pile of scrap metal back to England, but he knew the math didn't add up. He was a sitting duck in the heart of enemy territory. On the ground below, a German fighter ace named Franz Stigler was refueling his Messerschmitt Bf 109. Stigler was a legend. He already had 22 confirmed kills. If he shot down just one more bomber, he would be awarded the Knight's Cross, the highest military honor in Nazi Germany. Stigler saw the crippled B-17 limping through the sky. He scrambled his jet, roared into the air, and closed the distance in seconds. He pulled up behind the American bomber, his finger resting on the cannon trigger. He looked through his sights, ready to deliver the final blow. But as he got closer, Stigler saw something that made him freeze. He didn't see a formidable enemy. He saw through the jagged holes in the American plane's fuselage. He saw the wounded men trying to help each other. He saw the blood-stained walls of the cabin. To Stigler, it didn't look like a war machine anymore. It looked like a flying hospital. Stigler remembered the words of his first commanding officer, who had told him, "You are fighter pilots first, last, always. If I ever hear of one of you shooting at someone in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." To Franz Stigler, that crippled B-17 was a parachute. He took his finger off the trigger. He didn't fire. Instead, he did something that would have gotten him executed for treason if his commanders had found out. He pulled his fighter plane alongside the American cockpit and looked Charlie Brown right in the eye. The Predator had decided to become the Guardian. And at that moment, a bond was formed between 2 enemies that would defy a world at war and last for half a century. Part 2. The Guardian. Charlie Brown looked out of his shattered side window and felt his heart stop. A German Messerschmitt Bf 109 was flying less than 20 feet away from his wingtip. He could see the German pilot clearly, the goggles, the oxygen mask, and the steady, haunting gaze of a man who had the power to end his life with a single click of a button. Charlie reached for his microphone, trying to tell his crew to get to the guns, but there was no one left to answer. Most of his men were unconscious or dead, and his own machine guns were frozen solid, useless against the German steel. He waited for the flash of the cannons. He waited for the end. But the end never came. Instead, he saw the German pilot doing something strange. Franz Stigler was gesturing wildly. He was pointing down toward the ground, then toward the east, the land of the neutral. Franz Stigler was screaming inside his cockpit, even though he knew the Americans couldn't hear him. He was trying to tell Charlie Brown to land. Stigler knew that the Olde Pub would never make it across the North Sea to England. The plane was too heavy, the engines were too weak, and the fuel was pouring out of the wings like blood from an open wound. He wanted them to land in Germany. They would become prisoners of war, yes, but they would be alive. When Brown didn't respond, Stigler tried another plan. He pointed toward the north, toward Sweden. Sweden was a neutral country, only 30 minutes away. If they could just turn the plane, they could find safety in a neutral harbor. But Charlie Brown, dazed from the lack of oxygen and the trauma of the battle, didn't understand. He only knew one direction, west, back to England. back to the home he thought he would never see again. Becoming the shield when Stigler realized the Americans were going to try for the North Sea or die trying. He made a choice that defied every rule in the Nazi playbook. He didn't peel away. He didn't return to his base. Instead, he moved his fighter plane into a tight formation with the crippled B-17. He positioned his Messerschmitt on the side of the bomber that was most heavily damaged, placing his own body and his own aircraft between the Americans and the German ground batteries. As they approached the German coastline, the massive flak towers, the terrifying anti-aircraft guns of the Atlantic Wall, began to track the bomber. The gunners on the ground saw the American giant limping toward the sea. They prepared to fire. But then, they saw the German fighter. The gunners were confused. They saw a Messerschmitt flying so close to the enemy that they couldn't fire without hitting their own ace. They assumed the German pilot was forcing the American plane to land, or perhaps he was leading a capture. Because of Franz Stigler's presence, the guns of the Reich remained silent. Stigler was literally acting as a human shield for the men he was supposed to kill. The final salute. They reached the edge of the North Sea. The open water stretched out before them, a cold, gray expanse that led back to England. Stigler knew he could go no further. If he flew over the water, he would be a target for Allied patrols. He looked one last time at the young American pilot in the cockpit of the Olde Pub. He saw the blood on Charlie Brown's face. He saw the sheer, raw determination in his eyes. Franz Stigler pulled his fighter plane back, just a few feet away. He leveled his wings. Then, he did something that Charlie Brown would remember for the next 50 years. He looked at Charlie, raised his hand to his forehead, and gave a sharp, formal military salute. It wasn't a salute to an enemy. It was a salute to a fellow airman. It was a salute to the shared humanity that still existed somewhere beneath the uniforms and the propaganda. Stigler pulled his stick back, banked his Messerschmitt to the left, and vanished into the German clouds. He left the Americans alone in the silence of the North Sea, with nothing but a dying airplane and 1,000 miles of hope between them and home. As the German fighter disappeared, Charlie Brown sat in his freezing cockpit, shaking. He didn't know the German pilot's name. He didn't know why he had been spared. But he knew that he had just witnessed a miracle at 20,000 feet. The guardian angel was gone, but the miracle was just beginning. Part 3. The Silent Secret. Against all odds of physics and fate, the Olde Pub cleared the white cliffs of England. When the wheels finally touched the runway at Seething Air Base, the ground crew stood in frozen silence. They didn't see a plane, they saw a skeleton of metal. The bomber was so shredded that you could look through the fuselage and see the sky. The hydraulic fluid had painted the belly of the plane red. Charlie Brown, barely alive and trembling from the cold, climbed out of the cockpit and told his superiors exactly what had happened. He told them about the German pilot. He told them about the escort, the human shield, and the salute. But instead of a hero's welcome for the story of the century, Charlie was met with a wall of ice. The military brass looked him in the eye and gave him a direct order. Do not tell a soul. Never speak of the German pilot again. The reason was cold and tactical. The Allied High Command didn't want their soldiers to think the enemy was human. They didn't want their pilots hesitating in a dogfight because they thought the man in the other cockpit might be another Franz Stigler. Charlie Brown was forced to bury the miracle. He went back to war, flew more missions, and eventually went home to West Virginia. But every night when he closed his eyes, he saw that Messerschmitt. He saw that salute. The secret on the other side, across the English Channel, Franz Stigler landed his fighter at his base in Germany. He was covered in sweat. He knew that if he was caught, he would be hanged as a traitor. When his commanding officer asked why he didn't shoot down the bomber, Stigler lied. He told them the plane was already destroyed and had crashed into the sea. He told them his guns had jammed. He kept the truth locked in a vault inside his heart for the next 40 years. Stigler survived the war, flying the legendary Me-262 jet fighter in the final days of the Reich. He eventually moved to Canada to start a new life, leaving the ghosts of the Luftwaffe behind. But like Charlie, he never forgot the B-17 he had protected. He often wondered, did they make it? Did that young pilot survive the North Sea? The search begins. Decades passed. The world moved on. The Cold War came and went. Charlie Brown became a grandfather, a successful man with a quiet life. But the mystery of 1943 wouldn't let him go. In the late 1980s, at a reunion of his old bombing group, Charlie decided he couldn't die without knowing the name of the man who had saved him. He started writing letters. He contacted the German Air Force Association. He wrote in a newsletter for former fighter pilots, asking a simple, desperate question. I am looking for the man who spared my B-17 on December 20th, 1943. Are you out there? For months, there was silence. People told him he was chasing a ghost. They told him the German pilot was likely dead, lost in the final slaughter of the war. But then, thousands of miles away in British Columbia, Canada, an old man opened his mail. Franz Stigler read the letter. His hands began to shake. He sat down and wrote a response that would change both of their lives forever. He wrote, I was the one. I was the pilot. The secret that had been buried under 40 years of silence and military censorship was finally out. The two men who had shared 10 minutes of life and death in the clouds were about to find out that a salute across a battlefield was only the beginning of their story. Part 4. Brothers in Arms. In June 1990, a hotel lobby in Seattle, Washington, became the setting for a moment that defied the gravity of history. Charlie Brown stood there, his hands trembling, looking at the door. He was no longer the 21-year-old pilot in a shredded B-17. He was a man in his 60s, a grandfather, carrying the weight of a 47-year-old mystery. The door opened and in walked Franz Stigler. The room went silent. These two men had last seen each other through the distorted glass of cockpit canopies, surrounded by fire, smoke, and the roar of engines. They had been shadows to one another, one a predator who chose mercy, the other a victim who found a miracle. They didn't shake hands. They didn't exchange formal military greetings. They fell into each other's arms and wept. Franz Stigler, with tears streaming down his face, leaned into Charlie's ear and said the words that finally broke the spell of the war. He said, I love you, Charlie. The brother I never had from that moment on. The German Ace and the American pilot were no longer enemies. They weren't even just friends. They became brothers. For the next 18 years, they were inseparable. They traveled together across the United States and Canada. They spoke at flight schools, military bases, and museums. They didn't talk about the glory of combat or the number of kills. They talked about the one moment in their lives when they chose to be human instead of being soldiers. Charlie Brown finally got to introduce Franz to the men who were on that plane, the men whose lives were saved by a single finger moving away from a trigger. He introduced Franz to his children and his grandchildren. He told them, this is the man who made your lives possible. Franz, who had lost his own brother, August, in the early days of the war, told everyone that Charlie was the brother he had finally found again. The hole in his heart, left by the tragedy of the Third Reich, was finally being filled by the friendship of his former enemy. The Final Flight. The story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown is a story of perfect timing. It's as if the universe held its breath until the very end. In 2008, after nearly 2 decades of brotherhood, the two men prepared for their final mission. They had spent their golden years telling the world that war is a madness and that compassion is the only victory. In March of 2008, Franz Stigler passed away in Canada at the age of 92. Only a few months later, in November of that same year, Charlie Brown followed him. He was 86. They had lived through the most violent century in human history. They had stared death in the face at 20,000 feet. And in the end, they left this world in the same year, as brothers who had proved that a salute is more powerful than a cannon, and that love is the only thing that can truly survive a war. The monument to mercy today, the story of the Olde Pub, is taught in military academies around the world. But it's not taught as a lesson in tactics. It's taught as a lesson in ethics. It serves as a reminder that even in the darkest systems, even under the most brutal regimes, the individual still has a choice. Franz Stigler didn't have to save those 9 Americans. He could have taken his medal and moved on. But he chose to listen to the small, quiet voice of his conscience. If you visit the graves of these 2 men, you won't just see the records of pilots. You will see the legacy of a miracle. Because of one man's mercy in 1943, thousands of people, the descendants of those 9 crew members, are alive today. They are doctors, teachers, parents, and friends. They are the living fruit of a single second of compassion in a sky full of hate. The German ace and the American pilot are gone now, but their story remains hovering forever in the clouds, telling us that even when the world is on fire, you can still choose to be the person who brings the water. Part 5. The Ripple Effect. We often think of war as a series of subtractions. We count the lives lost, the cities destroyed, and the years wasted. But the story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown is a story of addition. It is a story about how one man's refusal to kill created a biological and spiritual explosion that is still felt today. The living monument. When Franz Stigler watched the Olde Pub disappear into the North Sea mist in 1943, he wasn't just saving 9 men in a metal box. He was saving an entire future. Historians and genealogists have spent years looking into the families of the crew of that B-17. Because those 9 men survived, because they went home to West Virginia, to Michigan, and to Iowa, they had children. Those children had children. Today, it is estimated that more than 250 people are alive right now, simply because Franz Stigler did not pull a trigger. These are doctors who have saved lives. They are teachers who have inspired thousands of students. They are engineers, artists, and parents. They are a living, breathing monument to mercy. When you look into the eyes of a great-grandchild of one of those crew members today, you are looking at the direct result of a German pilot's conscience. The Knight's Cross of the Soul. For decades, Franz Stigler felt like a failure because he never received the Knight's Cross, the medal he would have earned if he had shot down Charlie Brown. He felt like he had betrayed his country. But in his final years, Franz realized something profound. He told a friend that the friendship he shared with Charlie was worth more than any piece of metal a dictator could pin to his chest. He called it his Knight's Cross of the Soul. The German military eventually recognized this too. Modern German Air Force officers now study this encounter. It is used as a case study in Inner Führung, the German military philosophy of inner guidance. It teaches young soldiers that they are not robots. They are moral agents. It teaches them that an order to kill is not always an order to be followed, and that the highest duty of a soldier is to humanity itself. The miracle of the Olde Pub, and what of the plane? The Olde Pub was scrapped shortly after the war. Its metal melted down and recycled. But the spirit of that aircraft has become a legend in the world of aviation. Aerospace engineers still study the damage reports from that day. They use it to understand the survivability of aircraft. But more than the engineering, they study the luck. They realize that the plane didn't just stay in the air because of Boeing's design. It stayed in the air because it had a guardian. In every major air museum from Washington, D.C. to London, you will find a plaque or a painting of this encounter. It has become the North Star for pilots. It reminds them that even at 500 miles per hour, in a cockpit filled with fire, you can still choose to be a gentleman. The final lesson for a divided world. As we close this chapter on the German ace and the American pilot, we are left with one final question. Why does this story matter so much to us now, 80 years later? It matters because we live in a world that is often divided by walls, borders, and ideologies. We are told to see the other as an enemy, as a statistic, or as a target. Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown showed us that the uniform is just fabric. The flag is just a symbol. Beneath it all, There's a heart that beats just like yours. Franz saw himself in Charlie. He saw his own brother in the wounded men in the back of that plane. Their story tells us that peace doesn't always start with a treaty signed by politicians in a palace. Sometimes peace starts with a single pilot in a single cockpit, deciding that today he will not be a killer. Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown are gone now. Their voices are silent. But every time a soldier chooses mercy over malice, every time a stranger helps an enemy, and every time we choose to see the human being instead of the uniform, their final flight continues. They didn't just survive a war, they conquered it. And in doing so, they gave us a blueprint for how to save the world, one choice at a time. Part 6, The Code of the Skies. In the Grand Theater of World War II, there were millions of acts of violence, but only a handful of acts that redefined what it means to be a human being. As we look back at the meeting of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown, we have to ask the most difficult question of all: why? Why did a man who had lost his brother to the Allies, a man who was one kill away from his nation's highest honor, choose to risk the firing squad for the enemy? The answer doesn't lie in military manuals. It lies in a secret code, a code of honor that existed long before the swastika and lasted long after the smoke of Berlin cleared. The ghost of Gustav Rodel. To understand why Franz Stigler didn't pull the trigger, we have to go back to the deserts of North Africa. Years before he met Charlie Brown, Franz had a mentor, a legendary commander named Gustav Rodel. Before their first mission, Rodel looked his pilots in the eye and said something that would haunt Stigler for the rest of his life. He said, "If I ever hear of any of you shooting at someone in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." Rodel wasn't just talking about men hanging from silk chutes. He was talking about the honor of the air. He believed that you fight the machine, not the man. When the machine is broken, the man is no longer your enemy, he is a survivor. In that moment over Germany in 1943, when Stigler looked at the shredded B-17, he didn't see a target. He saw a parachute. He heard Rodel's voice whispering in his ear. He realized that if he fired, he would be killing his own soul. He chose to be a pilot, not a murderer. The defeat of propaganda. The Nazi regime spent millions of marks trying to convince men like Franz Stigler that Americans were untermenschen subhumans. They taught them that mercy was a weakness and that the Reich was everything. But propaganda has a limit. It stops at the glass of a cockpit canopy. When Stigler pulled up alongside Charlie Brown, the distance between them was only 20 feet. In that tiny space, the entire ideology of the Third Reich collapsed. Stigler saw the sweat on Charlie's brow. He saw the terror in his eyes. He realized that they were the same. Two young men, thousands of miles from home, caught in the machine they didn't build. By saving Charlie, Franz was committing an act of rebellion. He was saying that the individual's conscience is more powerful than the dictator's decree. The final flight together, in the year 2008, as both men felt their time on Earth coming to an end, they spoke about their deaths. They weren't afraid. They felt they had already done their most important work. They had spent 18 years proving that the world can heal. They had shown that a German and an American could sit at the same table, share the same bread, and call each other brother. When Franz Stigler passed away in March, he left a note for Charlie. When Charlie passed away 8 months later, he left a world that was a little bit brighter because of their story. They didn't just survive the war. They transcended it. They took the jagged, broken pieces of 1943 and glued them back together with friendship. The conclusion: you have a choice. As we finish this series, the story of the Ace and the pilot leaves us with a final challenge. Every day, in our own lives, we are faced with cockpit moments. Moments where we have the power to destroy someone, to fire the cannon of our anger, or to take our finger off the trigger. We are reminded that honor isn't something you are born with. It's something you choose, second by second, especially when it's hard. Especially when it's dangerous. Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown are now flying in a sky where there are no borders, no flat towers, and no enemies. They leave us with the greatest lesson of the 20th century. You always have a choice. Even in the middle of a world at war, you can choose to be the miracle. The engines have stopped, the propellers have stilled. But the salute between these two brothers will echo forever in the history of the human heart. Fair winds and following seas, Franz and Charlie. The mission is finally over.